Hey guys, welcome back. This is a follow-up of our series of videos related to how do we test event-driven microservices. In the previous video, we have tested our customer microservice. So let's remember that our customer microservice has some APIs. Then we add the Spring Cloud Contract Verifier dependency. The Spring Cloud Contract Verifier generate and run the tests. Then we use the Maven command. We can use Maven or even other dependency management such as Gradle. Okay, so we have packaged our application as a jar. If we inspect the jar, for example, the stubs.jar, we will see the contract and the stubs inside that jar. And then we publish our jars to our repository. It can be, for example, GitLab, Nexus, or even our local repository. So in this video, we are going to test the consumer side, which in our case is our decision microservice. So let's go and we will come back soon. Now, as we can see, we have here our decision microservice, right? This is the decision microservice, which consumes the events that our customer microservice produces. So this microservice handle the event, okay, and then publish to another topic. In order to test the consumer side of this microservice, we need to add some dependencies, right? So if you remember, the producer microservice has published, right, the stubs and the contracts in our repository. Okay, it's not the Nexus because we are testing locally. It's in our local repository. So we need to have the dependency that will allow us to get this contract and use in our test. So in that order, I'm here in the Maven repository. So we are going to get this dependency, Spring Cloud Contract Stub Runner. Let's add the dependency in our decision microservice. Now we need to get another dependency which can help us also in order to test, okay, which is the Spring Cloud Contract Wire Mock. Let's add the dependency here. Let's reload our project and that's good. So now let's create our test. We can call it by, for example, let's say integration test. In that order, let's create our package. In our case, let's just call it by handle customer created event. And let's add the suffix integration test. So now that we have here our handle customer created event, right? The first thing that we are going to do here, we are going to add, for example, the Spring Boot test. So remember, this annotation is very dangerous, but we are going to improve in the future videos this test. So now that we have here Spring Boot test, we need another configuration, which is provided by Spring Cloud Contract. So the configuration is auto-configure stub runner. So having here the auto-configure stub runner, we need to add here some stuffs. So for example, we need to specify the stub mode that we are going to run. So in that order, let's use the stub mode and let's use, for example, here stub runner properties, okay? And let's use in our case the local one, okay? So we are going to run it locally. For example, if you want to run it remotely, so you have to specify here remote, okay? So in that order, it will take your stubs, okay, from your repository, because when you put the remote, you should specify the repository. So for example, like this, and for example, we specify the repository and you here set the the path to your repository. But in our case, let's just use it locally. So let's put here local. Now we need to say, okay, for this test, which stubs we are going to use. So we are just going to use one stub, okay? We are going to specify here as ID. So if we are, for example, using more than one, of course, it should be an array. But in our case, we are just going to use one stub, right? So the question here is, how do we know the stub, right? The ID that we are going to use. So in that order, the Spring Cloud contract has the following syntax. So first we specify, so we are going to consume the event that the customer microservice is producing. So the first thing that we are going to add, for example, the group ID. So let's just copy this group ID from our producer side. Let's go back to our consumer and let's paste first the group ID. So the second thing that we have to specify is the artifact ID. So after having the artifact ID, we need to specify the version. For example, I think in our producer side, okay, the version is the, let's suppose here, let's just put here, for example, let's go back here. The version should be, for example, this version, and then we say that this is a stub, okay? So we say that it's a stub. So let's suppose that you have different versions of the customer microservice. So in that order, if we want to get, for example, the latest version, we just set it as a plus here. So it will get the latest version. So after having it like this is the way that we set up, okay, the stub runner. So now we have all the features in order to get, okay, our stubs. So now the next thing that we have to do, we have just to inject the stub finder, the one that will find the stub, right? Stub finder, so the name speaks for itself. So in that order, let's just inject it using the annotation at auto wire, right? And let's provide here the stub finder. So now that we have here the stub finder, it's the time that we can, for example, now create our test. So our test can be, for example, handle event. So in that order, let's create our test. Let's put like this, and of course we have to annotate it as a test, right? And yeah, the next thing that we are going to do, we are going to use the stub finder, okay, in order to, for example, trigger, okay, using the label. Do you guys remember the label? So let's go back to our producer side. So we are in our producer side. If you remember, we have created here the label, right? As we can see here, the label is a mean of which the output message can be triggered. So we are going to use this label in our consumer side. So let's go back to our consumer side and let's put here the label, okay? Like this. So we are going to use this stub finder, okay? And we are going to trigger, okay, this event. So what we are going to expect after triggering the event, I think we can, for example, also, let me just think, we can inject here also, okay, the repository, or yeah, let's see, let's inject here the decision, okay, the decision repository, because we are going to use the repository in order to find, okay, we are going to use the decision repository in order to see if we handle the event, okay, and if we, for example, persist the result of the computation into our database, okay? So that's why we are going to use here, for example, the repository. And now let's see, for example, after we trigger the event, right, this event here, we are going to check if we got the event and if our application had, for example, handled this event, right? So in that order, for example, we are just going to use, for example, this that decision repository, that find all, because we just want to see if we get some decision, okay? So find all, and I think we can just, for example, yeah, find any, okay? So find any, and then let's just use here, okay, as optional decision, and we can, for example, assert, okay, using the assertions, we can assert that the optional, okay, decision, for example, is not empty. So we are going to see if the decision is present. So let's run our test. And let's take a look what's happening here.